What's going on, everybody? This is Bobby G, aka Bobby Bookworm, back again with another Saturday Shpiel. Back on schedule, hopefully for a while. This is going to be one of the last couple ones in the next couple of weeks. And then I'm taking a break after Thanksgiving through the holiday season, just so everybody knows. Before I do that, I will make sure, along with this video, that in the next couple of videos that I will put the list for this next few weeks study up for everyone to study while I'm out. That said, this week is Parashat Toledot. Toledot is the Hebrew word for generations. The scriptures for this week are Genesis chapter 25 verse 19 to chapter 28 verse 9, Malachi chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 2 verse 7, Matthew chapter 10 verses 21 to 38, and Romans chapter 9 verses 1 through 13. And I kind of want to call this Adonai's choice because when I look at everything that's going on and everything that is spoken of in this particular passage, I find that ultimately it's God's choice, despite what our plans are as people. In the book of Genesis, we see Adonai and what's going on with Isaac, eventually getting married to Rebekah, and eventually him and Rebekah having twins, Esau and Jacob, and the struggle between those two. And really, Esau, people talk about Jacob, his name is supplanter, and Jacob was a hustler and what have you. The thing is, Esau sold his birthright and then got tricked out of his blessing in that particular passage. And he married women of other tribes that, as far as that marriage goes, was considered not kosher by Isaac and Rebekah. So Esau wasn't exactly an obedient son either. So as far as that passage goes. And that goes into Malachi, which talks about the Kohanim, which is the priests of the temple, because, God's basically saying, you're disrespecting me. And they're like, well, how are we disrespecting you? And he's like, you're disrespecting me because you treat, my altar and you treat my house, meaning Solomon's temple at the time, or the temple of Adonai, with contempt. And you're like, oh, it's so tedious. Oh, it's so routine, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, y'all need to get right and not be so disrespectful in God's house, or before God in general, for that matter. And you look at Matthew, it talks about, it's a passage that I think a lot of people get twisted, because it's like, Jesus is a God of love. God is a God of love. God is also a God of justice. Like, let's not get it twisted. And, he knew the price that it would cost to follow him. And I've learned that now, as of tomorrow, it'll be 22 years of following God, as of tomorrow. And, the passage of Matthew talks about, do not think that I have come to bring peace. I have not to bring peace but a sword. But a father will turn against the son, parents against their children, children against their parents, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. And it's not that he intentionally is causing a family feud or anything like that, but if you look at the context of Scripture, it talks about following him. Like, there's a price to following him, is what that particular passage is about, that Jesus is preaching on. Is that there's a price to following him. And sometimes it costs us what matters most to us. And that's the thing with Malachi, going back there for a second, is that the priests were giving sacrifices that were not right before God, because they were giving defective sacrifices when they should have given, so to speak, unblemished sacrifices. Because in Torah, it talks about when they have Exodus, Leviticus, and stuff, God specifically lays out what kind of sacrifices are appropriate to give, what type of sacrifices to give on his altar, and what types not to give. And these priests in Malachi were getting yelled at, so to speak, or they were getting rebuked by God because they were giving unlawful or unauthorized sacrifices, or blemished sacrifices. And that's the thing that needs to be taken into account here. In the case of Romans, again, we look at, Esau may have been the older of the twins, but it was Jacob through whom God was going to do his will. You look at their behaviors, there's a lot there going on, and we'll get back to that in the next couple of weeks, but it's Adonai's choice, which means it is God's choice what is to be done and what is not to be done. And it is God's way that is going to stand rather than our own. And that's something that we have to keep in mind whenever we're going through and we're looking for what God is speaking to us. Because honestly, sometimes what we're looking for and what God is looking for can often be polar opposites. So we need to keep that in mind when we're looking through and we're looking for God's will. That it's God's choice. What God chooses to speak to us. And even Jesus says in Matthew, there is nothing concealed that shall not be revealed, and nothing hidden that shall not be made known. And he also talks about whatever I speak to you in the dark, proclaim in the light. And whatever I speak to you in the room, speak on the rooftops. It's a thing of like when God tells us to do something, when God tells us to go somewhere, we would do well to be obedient to God, to go where he tells us to go, and to speak what he gives us to speak, as the prophets often did, that he sent in the Old Testament, and even as John the Baptist and Jesus, Yeshua, himself did. So these are things that we need to keep in mind when we're going through, that it is God's choice and it is God's will that we are to do, and whatever God chooses for us to do, we would be well to follow through with. My name is Bobby G, aka Bobby Bookworm. This is my Saturday Shpiel. God willing, I will see you guys next week. Shalom.